Well, let's give it a second try. I think I'm experiencing some technical difficulties, but I'm giving it a second launch and see if we can get it going right now. We're studying the book of Philippians together. We're looking at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. And Paul is writing to the church at Philippi. He's writing from Rome. Now, Paul had a great passion for the gospel. Paul tells us that God set him aside to preach the gospel of Christ. And he had a tremendous passion for preaching the gospel. Paul said in his letter to the Romans, he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and to the Gentiles. And so Paul had a tremendous passion to advance the gospel and take the gospel to places where it had never been preached. And he was a faithful preacher of the gospel. He looked for every opportunity to advance the gospel. But Paul's greatest desire was to go to Rome and preach the gospel. Rome was the hub of the Roman world. It was the center of the world of that day. And so more than anything else, Paul had a great passion to get to Rome and to preach the gospel in Rome. Now, Paul wanted to go as a preacher of the gospel. He didn't want to go as a prisoner, but in the providence of God, God brought Paul to Rome as a prisoner. So he's in Rome, he's in prison, he's awaiting trial, and he's in difficult circumstances. But he doesn't see those circumstances as a defeat. He sees them as an opportunity to preach the gospel where he is. And what enables Paul to have that perspective on why he is in Rome is that he had a single mind that was focused on Christ. His mind was fixed on Christ and making Christ known wherever he went. And so he's viewing his circumstances now as he is in Rome through the lens of his commitment to Christ and the desire to take the gospel and to share the gospel and to make Jesus known there. He has an unusual place. He's in the prison. He's not free to go preach gospel crusades. He's not free to go to the great centers of places and share the gospel. He's chained to Roman soldiers. He's bound there, but he has those Roman soldiers, and they're chained to him. And so he has different Roman soldiers that he has the opportunity to see throughout the day and to share the gospel with. So he's able to share the gospel with those Roman soldiers. He's able to share the gospel with Roman officials, and he does it with great joy. He doesn't find his joy in the circumstances, but he finds his joy in Christ because he has a singleness of mind on Christ and sharing Christ. It gives him a different perspective about his circumstances. And it shows us how, as we face the challenge of our time, as we face the crisis that we're facing today, that if we keep our minds fixed on Christ, he can give us joy in the midst of the crisis that we're going through. And in this time that we're going through, if we'll keep our minds fixed on Christ, he'll show us ways and opportunities that we can make him known to those around us in where he has placed us in our community. You see, we can't lose sight of what our mission is in the midst of the crisis that we're going through. We're not able to gather for worship like we normally are. We're not able to visit in large groups. So we're living in a challenging day, but still our mission remains the same as Paul's mission. That is to share the gospel and make Jesus known where we are. Now, I want us to just jump into text, and I want you to see how the singleness of mind that Christ had that Paul had for Christ, and the passion for his mission gave him a different perspective of the circumstances in which he found himself. He says, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." Now, if you'll notice that statement right there, he says the things that happened to me. He's talking about the hardships that he's endured. He's talking about the difficulties that he's faced. He's talking about the shipwreck that he experienced. He's talking about being arrested and being falsely tried, and all the tribulation that he's experienced in getting to Rome. And notice that he simply says, these are things that happened to me. It's interesting. Paul could probably have written a book on the sufferings that he experienced and the trials and the tribulations and the difficult time that he had. But rather than writing a book in which he describes all of the difficulties and hardships that he had to endure to get the gospel out, to share Jesus with people, he simply says, these things happened to me. And notice he says, these things happened to me actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. See, Paul saw everything that happened to him as happening to him in order that he might share the gospel and make Christ known. In verse 13, he says, "So that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ." Now imagine, he's chained. He's bound to these Roman soldiers. But notice that he describes these chains as his bonds in Christ. He sees everything as being unto Christ. And notice what he says, verse 14, "Most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear." And Paul sees that the sufferings that he has endured, the hardships that he has had, has actually encouraged others and given them greater boldness in sharing the gospel. So Paul sees everything that's happening to him as being an opportunity to further the gospel and to make Christ known, even to the point where it's giving others courage and boldness to share Jesus without fear. Notice he says here in verse 15, "Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing to have add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice and will rejoice." And so Paul sees every circumstances that has befallen him with joy, because he sees the gospel being furthered. He sees Christ being magnified and made known. And as he's facing these difficulties, not only of being in prison, but also having others who are preaching Christ without sincerity. They're preaching Christ out of a selfish ambition. But Paul he's not overcome by that. But what was central to him was that the gospel was being made known, Jesus was being preached, and Christ was being magnified, and souls were being won to Christ. And so it made what was most important to Paul was that Jesus was being made known and he was being magnified. And so it was only because Paul had this singleness of focus on Christ and making Christ known and magnifying Christ that he was able to see that this was the great opportunity was being fulfilled, that Christ was being made known, that Christ was being magnified, and he rejoiced in that. He found joy in that. And so what you see is Paul here is putting Jesus first in the midst of the trials and the tribulations and the struggles that he's facing. But the second thing that you see about Paul in this passage, in this difficult time that he's going through, is he's not only putting Jesus first, he's not only making Christ central in his focus and in his life, but he is also putting others second. He's putting Jesus first, he's putting others second. You know, we've all heard that expression about joy. How do you find joy in life? Well, someone has said joy, you find joy when you put Jesus first, others second, and you last. And as we walk through the book of Philippians, that's exactly what we see Paul doing. He's putting Jesus first, he's putting others second, he's putting himself last. He's seeing everything that's happening to him as an opportunity to advance the gospel, to share Christ with those there in Rome. And so, and as Paul there is chained to these Roman soldiers, he has a captive audience. These Roman soldiers can't leave. They can't go watch TV. They can't go to the mall. They can't go anywhere. They're bound to Paul. And Paul uses that opportunity to share the gospel with these soldiers. And Paul concludes that as a result of his being imprisoned and chained to these Roman soldiers, that he was able to win some to faith in Christ. Verse 13, he says, so that it has become apparent to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. The verse there gives us the indication that while Paul was chained to those Roman soldiers, as he shared the gospel with them, that he was able to lead many of them to faith in Christ. And what we see, what we learn, is that when we have a single-minded focus on Christ, that single-minded focus on Christ doesn't allow the circumstances of life to overcome us, just as the circumstances of life didn't overcome Paul. He turned those circumstances that he faced into opportunities to magnify Christ and to preach Christ and to win souls to Christ. And during these days, I pray that God would give us that single-minded focus on Christ that would enable us to overcome our circumstances rather than have our circumstances overcome us, and that we can turn whatever circumstances we face in these days into opportunities to make much of Jesus and to magnify Christ as we do so. But also we do that by putting others second. You know, one of the things that Paul could have done in the midst of this difficult situation he found himself in, he could have become self-centered, self-focused, and he could have become very selfish. But he didn't do that. You'll notice as we look at the text, he says in verse 22, if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I cannot tell. For I am hard pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. Now, if you'll notice there, what Paul is showing us is he's not putting himself first, but rather he's putting others first. He has great joy because he loves others. He prays for others. He encourages others. He seeks to bring joy to others. Paul's heaven on earth, if you will, was helping others. And you see, what you see here is what Paul says is that he longs to be with Christ, but yet he eagerly yearns to remain and to help these believers grow in Christ that he's writing to in Philippi, but also to continue trying to reach others for Christ. So what you see here is there's no selfishness in Paul's life. He's not self-focused, he's not self-absorbed, but he has his eyes and he's looking outward, and he's looking at how he can reach others for Christ and how he can minister to others for Christ. Let me encourage you in these days in which we are living today. Be careful. Guard against becoming self-focused. Guard against becoming self-preoccupied. Don't allow yourself to become selfish. Be looking for opportunities that you can help others in these days. Maybe it's just going to maybe it's just calling someone and encouraging them. Maybe it's writing a card of encouragement. Perhaps one of the things that you can do is we have shut-ins in our church. We have those who are in rest homes in our church. Call the church office, get their addresses, get their names, sit down, write a card of encouragement to them. Have your children draw a picture and send a card of encouragement to them. If they're shut-ins, pick up the telephone, call them, let them know that you're thinking about them, that you are praying for them. See if there's some way you can help them. While you're there with your children, one great thing you can do is use this as an opportunity to disciple your children, to teach your children how to have a quiet time, to teach them how to read the Bible on their own, how to have a spiritual journal, how to pray. Get your eyes off of yourself, get your eyes on others, and help them to grow in Christ. Help others who may have needs. Be sensitive. Look for creative opportunities that you can be selfless and not selfish. Then the third thing that you notice, you look at the word joy. If I'm going to know joy, even in the midst of difficult circumstances, not only must I put Jesus first and others second, but I have to put myself last. I have to put myself last. That's what Paul did. Look at what the text tells us here. He says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know." You see, what Paul realized is that his body was not his own. His future was not even his own. His reputation was not even his own. And you see, when we put ourselves first, it always brings misery. But when we put Jesus first, others second, then we're able to find the opportunity, and ourselves last, then whatever difficulties that affect our lives, we can get beyond those, and we won't get caught up in misery. We become very miserable when we put ourselves first. But when we learn to put ourselves last and put others before us and put Christ first, then that keeps us from becoming miserable. So whatever difficulties affects our lives this time during these days, I pray that we would be sure that we have a single mind that's focused on Jesus, that says, "Lord, whatever comes, whatever happens, the sole desire of my heart is that Christ is magnified and glorified in all that I say, in all that I do." My life's desire would be that Christ would be magnified by whether I live or whether I die. But the supreme desire of my heart is to make much of Jesus, to make him known, and to magnify him so that he alone gets the glory. Let me just remind you, this is a challenging day that we're passing through. Our God is bigger than anything that we're going through. He is faithful. He is good. His grace is sufficient. His peace is sufficient. His strength is sufficient. And even in the midst of these difficult days, if we'll fix our minds on Jesus Christ and have a singleness of focus on him, we can experience true joy as we rest in Christ. I pray that you have a great day today, and I'm praying for you and your family. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue our study of the book of Philippians. God bless.